So here we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Perspective Philosophy. I'm sat here with Rem, the Bath Boy.
That's
Rem
me.
is a third-year analytics student.
Yes. Third year analytic philosophy student at some certain university. Yeah, mostly studying analytic philosophy as opposed to continental philosophy, though. I don't think there's much of a divide, but people might disagree on that. So
We're all talking about the same thing in a different way. Sorry, I stopped
exactly.
talking there. I had to sort something out there because
No
I
problem.
had myself coming through my ears about 10 times.
Oh, I see.
Um, Yeah. So Rem is a third-year analytics student. Analytic philosophy tends to work in journals, so it's smaller articles in which they really delve into the, even just even sentences, paragraphs, and they make a paper on individual arguments and set one argument out within a couple of thousand words, and they then compile articles to have a full breadth of the system. Continental philosophy tends to work in books, so people tend to make and read books about issues. But we all are talking about very similar issues. So we're talking about very similar topic areas, and we just have different ways of approaching it. And usually, just a different language game, I think, is involved and invoked in both communities. But it should be interesting to see how we both approach a topic area in which we both had some experience. So Rem, as I've said, has been on Destiny streams before. He's a smart guy. I've talked to him before, and he's been brought on as an expert of philosophy.
An expert, yeah.
Well, I'd say that it's accurate. He's probably one of the best read third-year students I've ever talked to. So
Thank you. I appreciate
uh,
that.
he's got some really good knowledge of philosophy, and we both have discussed in brief. Ask yourselves polyaxiomatticsm. I'll say it right this time because I've got it wrong in the past. Um, and we want to really delve into this graph that we saw on one of Destiny's streams to try and work out what's going on here. Because I was saying to Rem, I've never seen an accurate definition of polyaxiomatticism. I don't know if you have. If you've seen a definition
No,
of it.
no,
No.
never before.
Yeah.
Especially not one that aims to actually provide some sort of quantification to it. That is clearly what the aim of this graph is to, because you'll have different types of moral pluralism, of course, but those sorts of approaches, at least from what I've seen, have never aimed to actually graph moral value compared to the sorts of values that they're attempting to bring together or reconcile with each other. And I certainly don't think that their approach to this makes any sense whatsoever.
Yeah, it's definitely confusing. If I sent you the graph, didn't I? There.
Mhm.
I'll see if I can share it for the viewers because the only place I could find the graph was just a nice screenshot from Destiny's stream. So I think if I go on here and I can screen share. Okay, so yeah. So can you see my screen there?
Yes, I cannot.
Yeah. So the screen, so the graph, if we want to run through it quickly, is the y-axis is moral value of a given action. The x-axis is well-being, well-being minus suffering. I don't know why it's well-being minus suffering because I mean that's kind of well-being.
Yeah, that is what well-being is.
That's
Yeah.
pain versus pleasure.
Yeah.
It seems that he should have probably put happiness minus suffering maybe, but that's
Yeah.
and then obviously graphed on it is apparently deontology, utilitarianism, and polyaxiomatticism. So this is his system here graphed onto the graph. Now, as from what I've understood of the graph, utilitarianism is it's basically moral value is in comparison to how much well-being. So the more of X, the more of Y. It's linear.
Yeah.
that seems to make somewhat sense to me. Deontology. I've talked to a few people about this, whether deontology is graft right, but we can talk about that as well. But I want to know your opinions first, or Rem. I want to know what you think of this graph.
Well, I mean, first of all, like I said earlier, I think the fundamental mistake here is attempting to sort of just take these two moral theories and put them on the exact same graph with what I think are pretty arbitrarily chosen axes. Actually, what you're getting at there with whether or not deontology is graphed right, I don't think it is, because I don't think you can even plot deontology on a graph whose x-axis is well-being, since deontology really doesn't take that into consideration at all, at least not, traditional Kantian deontology. So I'm not totally sure about that. And then I think the ultimate fundamental issue is just this idea of adding them together, and then you get this polyaxiomatic linear line, which I think is completely absurd because I don't think you can reconcile it in that sort of manner. And especially, you have all these questions about, well, do we take these two moral systems as having equal worth? Because, they're just simply adding them together. They're not multiplying one by a certain factor and giving emphasis to one over another in a certain situation. So it's not clear to me how any sort of graphing would it all be help. Actually, I think the very fundamental issue here is that a graph does absolutely nothing. It's not like it's acting as justification for the theory. It's not like it's really explaining anything. This says
Yeah,
nothing more than I'm trying to reconcile utilitarianism and deontology. So those are a few different issues that I've seen with it.
yeah.
Yeah.
I can't help but agree because I can't see the value of this graph as a whole, to be honest. Because I mean, depending on the utilitarianism, like you could see that as a rule deontology. So that you could see how you could graph rule deontology on this graph.
Hmm.
I could understand that. Yeah, that's easy enough done because then you'd say like, okay, well, it's always in respect to x.
Yeah.
That's clear. But with deontology, when you look at it, like for example, Kantian deontology, um, it's all about the meta ethic, isn't it? Because if you're
Hmm.
saying that, what is good in the first place is, duties for duty's sake, then how do you graph that against well-being? Because I mean, yeah, Kant does say that happiness is the rational end of all beings, but he clearly thinks that we have no understanding of how to bring that around beyond duty, and so we adhere to duty because duty itself is the value, and after that fact, then happiness is something that will arise from it because once we are good, then we will have a good outcome, pretty much.
Right.
But like at least that's what I got from the groundwork, and the point is I just don't see how you could put, let's say, Kantian deontology on this graph because it would only be y. I mean, you could write D here, and you could put like an arrow maybe like up and down. It would be purely y. It would not. I mean, like I think the point of the straight line is that it is not affected by x, and I see what they've done there. But I don't think that it's graphable because if you say that moral value for D is duty for duty's sake, and moral value for you is well-being, well, as soon as you graph one or the other, then you're going to have to look through it through either theory. So if you look through it through D, well, utilitarianism, well, as soon as you're not adherent to the rule, we're just gonna plummet on the y-axis, and it wouldn't work. And if you were to look at D, I mean U, sorry, and look at D, well, as soon as an outcome which is not in coherence with well-being happens, well, D is going to plummet on the y-axis. So what
Hmm.
the hell is y? Like, moral value of a given action has not been defined at all. It's
Hmm.
so arbitrary, it hurts. And I think this is like probably what they didn't want to get into. It's meta ethics. They've tried to create a normative ethical system, and they've just left a big meta ethical gap right here. And I just can't see them reconciling that with this graph alone. And from what I'm aware, the only I think we've both debated them on moral subjectivism versus objectivism, probably with different intention. But the subjectivists, or at least I think even Destiny on this stream, got them to admit that they are pretty much descriptive egoists.
Yeah.
So I don't see what these even represent, because if this is an actual deontological theory, and I'm thinking it can only be Ross's or something like that, maybe like W.D. Ross, who I think he's more of a particularist. And maybe this moral value is in relation to an understanding of good within a given situation, like an intuition. And then D would be like how well it adheres to your intuitions, and the outcome, how well the outcome adheres to your intuitions of how to bring maybe like a greater society later on. And it relates to that feeling of good, that understanding of good in the first place, and then there's right and stuff to take into consideration. But the point is that clearly it's value pluralism. So if we're going value pluralism, then I just don't think that you can graph. You're trying to combine moral value as Y. You're combining moral values in the first place. So it's almost like they're saying it's value pluralism, but it's not. And then they try and justify it with X. I don't know if you've got any more anything you would like to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there really is much more to say because I'm not even sure how they would. Actually, I think I do know how they would justify it, but the sort of justification that they're going to give for this sort of system and this sort of graphing is ultimately, I think, what I have had the biggest issue with, and which is the type of topic I always seem to delve into when I go onto Destiny's stream, which is very much that meta-ethical debate, and specifically the moral realism, moral anti-realism debate, because the way in which they justify this and the way that you can really justify absolutely anything is just by ditching the idea of normative claims in and of themselves, saying that there doesn't even exist some categorical end that we need to be tending to, that normative claims are completely non-factual. So ultimately, I can really do whatever I want. I construe these types of normative systems however I want because it is fitting towards some given end that I hold that ultimately is, just hypothetical in nature and doesn't actually really have any real bearing on whether or not your system is superior to another or not. And that's always the type of discussion I get into with Ask Yourself and Abby and Destiny, is this sort of moral realism, moral anti-realism debate. And then, of course, it always goes even further into an epistemic realism or epistemic anti-realism debate, which I think I think the fact that it actually has to devolve into discussions like that really just showcases how out of depth Ask Yourself and his troop is.
Yeah, I think we'll I think even he, for the most part, I know that in one experience you said that you had a bad experience with him, where it really devolved into this, and the conversation didn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
I'll stop sharing the screen because I don't know how useful anyone else will find it now. But yeah, so I remember you said that you will find, yeah, it devolved into something quite like not fruitful at all. It wasn't really a good philosophical, inquiry. And I know that he changed your name on the server to, what was it, like Sophist?
Yeah, Sophist, or
Yeah, and he
and
changed
he
mine to
changed his,
perspective.
well, he changed his own name to, unlike Rem, I don't believe in magic, because I'm a moral realist, and that means that I believe in
Yeah,
magic. I don't even
I
really know
don't
what.
I don't like. I mean, like for example, I don't know how they would say what they would argue is moral anti-realism. Like because I mean, what they're trying to say really is that you can't make truth claims. I think on
Yeah.
concepts of good, and I think that argument has been kind of blown out the water. I think.
Well, it's actually interesting. If I can jump ship on that, it's because what I guess this goes into more of the history of the Ask Yourself Destiny debate is there's a guy called JHC who you might have interacted with before, seen, who is, I think, a postgrad in philosophy. And he's sort of this authority figure that Ask Yourself and everyone else has sort of rallied around. And what ends up happening is that when you start to force Ask Yourself into this corner and say, look what you're actually having to accept, he will then go to GHC and try to figure out a way to weevil out of it, or
Yeah.
a way to bite that bullet in a fashion that is quote unquote acceptable in the literature. So in the case of when we get into the moral realism, moral anti-realism debate, what it initially started as was, I mean, the stream is on Destiny's YouTube channel. It was at the very end of the month that he got banned from Twitch. And I remember basically Destiny wanted to bring Ask Yourself and Avenite in, and I was saying that, oh, I'm a moral realist. And what ended up happening is that basically what they kept wanting to do is they wanted to quickly change the definitions mid-discussion to where realism is, an ontological statement versus an epistemic one. When I had insisted over and over again, when I say moral realism, I'm talking about something having a truth value. I'm not talking about, something existing in the actual world that is a truth maker for moral statements. I'm talking about whether or not statements even have truth. And then the next time I come on and they say, okay, well, yeah, I am a non-cognitivist. I don't believe moral statements have truth value. And I'm like, okay. And then I present them I wrote this big Reddit write-up where I basically detailed the companions and guilt argument and applied it to their position, which I thought was, I thought that was I thought that would
Yeah,
have been the end of
I
the
read that. It
story.
was useful. Like you would think that because the companions in guild argument, if you'd like to explain for our viewers.
Yeah, it's basically, it says, it goes off of this idea that all norms are universal, so that ethical norms, or norm is a bit of a weird word, but we can think of it like reasons to do something or reasons to believe in something. That the reasons why we ought to do certain actions and uh, strive towards whatever is good, these are similar types of reasons, or the same type of reasons why we ought to act rationally, or ought to tend towards the truth, or ought to hold that this form of justification is correct versus incorrect. And the companions and guilt argument says, okay, well, if you're going to be an anti-realist, meaning you don't believe that there is truth value to moral statements, then you also have to give up being an epistemic realist in holding that we have epistemic reasons for believing a certain theory of truth or a theory of meaning. And basically, what the hope is of this argument is to reveal to the ethical anti-realist that their position is undermining, in a sense, or even absurd. And at the very end of actually, I have a video on my YouTube channel where I basically do a video version of my post. I basically say, well, there is a way out of this, and this is to just completely bite the bullet and say that, well, just because my argument is circular doesn't matter. They actually bite circularity. And of course, this devolves into complete absurdity, and you're not doing philosophy anymore. It's all completely rhetoric. It's all sophistry. You're not at all engaging the literature. Nothing productive can be done, because at all points in time, whenever you're discussing with someone, you have to acknowledge that you are always going to be talking past each other, and there's no neutral ground under which we can say whether or not my position is more correct than yours, because
Yeah,
this neutral ground just doesn't exist for the epistemic anti-realist.
yeah, you end up in a situation where you can't make evidentiary claims at all, really. Or if you are, you making evidentiary claims in which are not in a grounded linguistical format. So like there is no language game between you, and there's no way to actually have a proper communication because you haven't
Right.
any set of principles that are guiding the conversation, which would be like logic and
Mhm.
so on. This is actually, weirdly enough, what Ask Yourself was pretty much arguing against
Yes, I know.
in his last debate with it was Primal Health and Jay Denver, I think he's called, who blocked me for some reason. I haven't even spoken to him, but it was quite funny to watch because he was on both sides just to give it some give some meat to this argument. you can see that Jay's basically arguing when you're watching it, like should, he's like should is an ethical statement, and he's like saying, well, why should we adhere to logic? And then, or like even the weight of logic, why should we, adhere to any logical statement as being true or not? And ask yourselves, like, trying to, argue against this. And he just basically keeps reasserting the fact that, P equal, if you get to P, then you can say P is not P. And then, but to say that you have to accept logic, but he won't accept logic in the first place. So the conversation actually goes nowhere. And it's just funny to watch because it's such a pointless argument that it ends with Jay storming off, going, just storming off, going, that, it was, what does he say? He says, you said should. And it's just like, I will ask yourself his credit. I don't think he even meant to say should in the same way that Jay took it as, but it becomes so petty that you just like, you said the word should and then left. And that is what kind of an argument, if you want to watch how these arguments work, that is the argument you will get into if you start going and denying like evidentiary claims, because there comes to the point in which you just got to admit, like, this conversation, it's not even a discourse anymore. But yeah, this is the point in which I think they ask yourself kind of goes down when he says that, moral claims don't have truth value. But with me, I don't think he went so far. I think he went and he really just wanted to be a subjectivist, which is absolutely fine. Although I'm not, but I mean by subjectivist, I think he means more like a particularist. He's not saying that they don't have truth value in as much as relating to the experience of an individual. I think he would probably admit that's a descriptive claim in this sense, at least in the conversation that from what I understood in his discourse. But it is funny that if you do press him on truth rather than on objective versus subjective, he fights the argument in a different way when it comes to epistemology. That's why when I said like what is truth to him in the debate, it didn't. He just started cutting us off and he started stumbling. So yeah, and I think just to clarify to everyone, if we're taking this as a subjective graph, like, because if we go back to the graph, if you look at the graph, like deontology, it's like, what is this relating to? What is it purporting? Is it purporting, what moral value is it? And the moral value for ask yourself, since he's a particularist or a subjectivist or whatever he might want to call himself, he's a total subjectivist. So he would argue that the moral value is just related to arbitrary methods of, whatever axioms you want to choose, man, And I don't know how many times you've heard that. How many times you've heard the word axiom?
Yeah, it's funny because I even asked them like, what is an axiom? And it's funny to see them sort of retreat into a sort of psychological or psychologism sort of route, and basically saying that, well, it's trying to reduce these logical axioms to what it seems to be a sort of psychological state. And what I always try to point out to them is that this is the sort of methodology that I've always took and continue to take, is that, well, psychologism is really a non-starter because it devolves into complete skepticism, as we've obviously seen. It seems to be almost entirely total skeptic. But when you start with psychology, you are actually not giving any sort of justification as to why we are prioritizing certain psychological states as being, the foundations for something like a logical axiom. And this was Frege's and Husserl's whole attack on psychologism, that it's completely instrumental in nature and that there's no actual content to these things that we purport to be objective and, a priori and whatnot. And it just devolves into total absurdity. I think we have to start at an epistemic foundation in order to even talk about something being psychological and whatnot. That's Kant's entire project. And it's funny to me that whenever you bring up Kant with ask yourself, he gets really pissy because he thinks that Kant is stupid and overrated. Of course, even though he's never read
Yeah.
a page of Kant before. So yeah.
I mean, bless him. I mean, like, I understand that. Like, for example, I appreciate that. Like, ask yourself. I'll give ask yourself his credit for like a layman who's never, went into philosophy. I think he overvalues his theory
Hmm.
a little bit too much. But like he can at least like he's I think he must have done like something in logic and argumentation because he really loves logic. But he does love this like idea of pure logic, and that's what he always tries to divorce it back to. And like if you look at the NTT argument, it's it's just a logical syllogism. It's actually contentless, but it's this idea that you can achieve like a moral grounding with pure logic, like pure reason, and it's like the reason he probably doesn't like Kant is because Kant just like nah, you can't do that. You
Yeah.
cannot. You cannot achieve any moral foundation, and obviously Kant is an objectivist, but even as a subjectivist, like I think the point is that he would actually eventually just says, oh well, the way you get your axioms. This is what he says to me, like the way you get your axioms, it's arbitrary. It doesn't matter where they come from,
Yeah.
whatever. You just have them. Um, and I mean that does seem a bit strange, but it's okay. Like we'll take it from that point. But that just means that this graph means that you like y. So what combines d and u in this situation is and p is actually just Fox given.
Yes.
It's how
Exactly.
it's how much you care about u, d, and p in the first place. So why well-being is on there is what then confuses me, because it seems like if moral value is purely Fox given, then why is there an X? Like it's. I think the only argument you could make is that X is a descriptive in relation to how much suffering is in the world. In which case, it's confusing because surely the only reason that you would like, obviously, the only value of that suffering is your fucks given in the first place. So there is only really like, if you look at it, it's like, what is it? P equals U plus D. Well, I mean, just P equals fucks given, U equals fucks given, and D equals fucks given for them even to be on the same graph. Because as soon as you would put like obviously like they would not function, you would have to have like a few different graphs in the first place. You would have to have like utilitarianism on a deontological graph like of moral value, and that meta ethic of good, and then you'd see utilitarianism when it doesn't adhere to the rule like plummeting, and the same for deontological values versus deontological rules versus well-being when they don't adhere to well-being, the plummet again. And then this third graph, which would just be like my fuck's given, and then you could see that there would be like some way to graph it. But that means that this graph, for me, like from my understanding of it, is just a snapshot of Isaac's emotional state at any given time. Because as he says, like the way we're adhere to these axioms is totally arbitrary in his opinion. So it's just opinions, tastes, and so on that we cannot make any, we cannot have a conversation about, because if we want to have a conversation about it, it would have to contain truth, and if it contains truth, then it's purporting to a reality in which there can be a right or a wrong. It can be a good or a bad, and we can be flawed about that in the first place. But since we can't be flawed about it, and he's a non-cognitivist, then, and I don't think he's as well, I don't think he's an error theorist. Just
Yeah,
to
I think it would make sense if he's something like, an emotivist or expressivist. Moral claims are simply more are our emotional reactions to certain situations, which would I guess, uh, make sense of this graph because, it is literally his fucks given at a given moment. This is his emotional expression at a time, and that would, of course, fall in with, an expressivist sort of outlook. But that, of course, is, a moral anti-realist stance, and uh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that's as far as you can really go with this graph. I think, like, I've talked it to death with my friends, like, with philosophy and stuff, and I've just been like, what is it? What and I've heard people like try and defend them a little bit, and they're not really, they don't really defend them past the point where they go, yeah, it is just fucks given. But like fucks given is what he will argue all moral theory is. So you'll just see like all moral theories fucks given. And so like as soon as you say, well, what's the use of this graph? You'd be like, well, what's the use of any moral theory? And you're like, for fuck's sake. But then I think the point is that the use of any moral theory, if you take this, and he tells us off for this, he doesn't like this. If you take this stance, the only value of this graph, the only value of trying to convey your ideas, if you're arguing that you cannot convey truth value in relation to what is good or bad, then the only point of trying to convey it is to convey your emotional state and to prescribe others to do it as well. So that would be like if you're an emotivist, as you say, or expressivist, or a prescriptivist, where you would say that this is good. You should think this is also good. Like you should too. Like and that's it. That is as far as it would go. And if he's willing to say that, all right, that's what all ethics is, then no wonder these conversations don't go anywhere. If you've watched him debate on any of these things, like he doesn't like to go to meta-ethics. He even said in this, like, we're not going to get derailed into meta-ethics. But if he doesn't go into meta-ethics and people are coming into this like, no, there is a good, I'm not saying that morals don't exist. Then I'm not a moral nihilist. And he's like, there is a good. Then of course we need to have this discussion of like, what is it? Like, if it exists, what is it? And then we can talk normatively about, like what system best achieves, maximization of this good. Like, but he doesn't like to do that. So I guess, like, as we say, we kind of can talk it to death. Of just like really like, I just want everyone to know, when you look at this graph, right? This is what I wanted, like, from this conversation. Just remember, it's fucks given on a graph, and it's a snapshot of just an emotional state on a graph. How much you care about utilitarianism versus how much you care about a deontological state equals how much you care when you combine them together. So, and he calls this a threshold deontology, which I don't think many threshold deontologists would appreciate, because it's just descriptive egoism. And I think Destiny actually hit the nail on the head with this. Like, he really got him to that point like that, and it was just like, all right, it's done,
Yeah. Interestingly enough, about the whole expressivism point, I don't totally understand the position, because if you acknowledge, like, if you were to get him to acknowledge, like, okay, yes, actually, this is just my emotional state, it calls into question how much rationality there really is in philosophy. Because if whenever I'm saying like, oh, you shouldn't kill someone, and I recognize that this is just an emotional expression, why am I not then thinking to myself, well, actually, my opinion here is just as valid as theirs. So why am I even playing this game of trying to get someone else to join my emotional side? What is this that is really going on? Am I predisposed to just endlessly argue my emotional state? I don't understand how you can pretend to have a rational discourse.
Power. It's just power.
Right.
Honestly, it is like, we might as well be playing chess.
Yeah.
That is the only way that you can see it, because it's funny because he says that, he called us sophists, but this is the sophist position.
It is, yeah. It's very ironic.
This is what they defend. Like, if you read any of the ancient Greek literature, which I suggest ask yourself this, because it would be really nice to get, you find that you'd be agreeing with the sophists constantly.
Yes, I know. That is, I've always sort of wanted to bring that up, but then I knew that I'd get into this discussion of, oh, well, what actually is a sophist? I'm like, there's no way that he can engage, on that sort of level, because I know he hasn't actually read the literature, which, again, I don't think that's necessarily a horrible thing, as long as you are willing to acknowledge on stream that there is a very good chance that your opinion on this is probably insufficient and is not ultimately correct. I mean, that's what I constantly do whenever I'm discussing a subject that I have not read enough literature on. And it's just the fact that he is completely 100% unwilling to shift his position. He's never willing to acknowledge, hey, yes, actually, I am wrong on this point, and is never willing to actually engage with, sort of the opposing viewpoint. And I think that's really dangerous for someone who has quite a large following. It's sort of just this sort of indoctrinated cult. which I think can be quite dangerous.
Well, yeah, 100%. I mean, like the lack of his fallibility, like he does not like, for example, I'm willing to say that like pretty much everything I say can be wrong.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I'm human, and we're all human, and we all can be wrong.
Hmm.
Um, when you debate, ask yourself, like, you just get told you're wrong a lot,
Yeah.
and he doesn't necessarily give you a reason of why you're wrong. He's just like, no, you're wrong, and then he goes to explain why, and then he just reiterates the same point he just made. So it's very annoying, and but the point is like, it comes to these like absurd claims of why you're wrong, and then you've got people in the comments section, going, like, Isaac's IQ was so high here, and it's just like, he's appealing to the mass. He's
Yeah.
appealing to, like, the worst point is, I think he even knows to some degree that he's appealing to the mass. Because if you look at his, like, NTT, like the name the trade, like, I know that you don't engage with much vegan philosophy, but
No,
I'm
I don't.
I'm going to be making a video on this, right? Because it kills us, right? Um, because it seems that, like, if you look at name the trait, it's like, if all categories, if humans have moral value, this is the original one. Then, if you could replace all of the traits of an animal with human traits, then an animal would have moral value and all this, right? And so if an animal has these traits, whatever trait it is, then it has moral value, right? Just to
Hmm.
give it a brief sort of understanding. But if you go to ask yourself, well, like, my trait, because he says like a trait can be anything, right? Pretty much, like, you can name any. It's like, it shouldn't even be called name the trait. It should be named the justification, because it's not necessarily something in the object. Because he says that a
Right.
trait, like, of a cow could be your moral value of the cow. So if you just value cows, then he would say that, oh, that's a trait of a cow. Um, but I just don't think that's a relation between me and the cow, and that's not necessarily a trait. I mean, the moral value of the cow in relation to a trait would be that there was something that gave it its cowness, and then I value cowness, and then that would be, how name the trait would work. And typically, that's why you end up with Bentham. The only morally considerable trait is suffering, and that's, that singer and all of that. And this is typically where vegans argue, but we'll not go into that. That's a more realist argument, that you've got to make the
Hmm.
point that, suffering is the only valuable trait that an animal can have. But he would go further. He'd say, like, like, no, any trait can be valuable, right? But logical consistency would say that, like, for example, we're going to see if you pick any of these traits and you are willing to bite the bullet and say that animal has moral value, let's say it's intelligence, whatever, or a combination of them, then you would say that, an animal would have moral value. And so he starts putting you, like, in a situation. So if you said that the trait was humanness, um, and you'd be like, well, what is humanness? I suppose would probably be the first thing you'd say. But you see that, even if you see that the trait is an IQ of above 50, then you'd go, well, you would, like, allow for the death of sentient, of children, or something like that. And if you're one of those kind of people that is a descriptive egoist, you're like, yeah, yeah, fine, I'll bite the bullet. He takes that as a victory, and then he'll say, well, that is just insane. And this is what gets us, and this is why I brought it up, because you'll say, like, this, you'll appeal to madness, and an appeal to madness is nothing more than a power play. It's nothing more than an appeal to popularity. This is like, Foucauldian philosophy. It's like, an understanding of, like, what is mad is what is not normatively accepted. So the point is like, veganism, though, in this situation is not the norm. We are the abnormal. We are the lower numbers of the population. So if people value humanness, and then they could just turn around and call us mad and brush us away, well, then you've just defeated veganism. So I don't see how a vegan can hold this position justifiably, and I don't see why anyone would be okay holding it, because it just seems a bit disgusting and toxic. Because ultimately, you're just using people as an end to your moral system. It's like, how can I achieve value for myself?
I, no, yeah, I don't know enough about specifically like veganism, but or the debate surrounding veganism, and specifically, I mean, it's such a complex issue, personal identity and personhood, and it's not a debate I really participated participate in at all. But I think there is just this general trend of Isaac regularly sort of dipping his toes in different areas of discourse, while not actually realizing a lot of these fundamental contradictions that result from taking all of these simultaneous viewpoints. I mean, the most laughable thing is him being a moral anti-realist while being a vegan.
Yeah,
Uh,
I don't know how you combine them two. I
no,
really
I,
don't know.
I don't understand either, but um, yeah, I don't think there's a lot left to say about it. I think
Yeah, I think we've probably killed this one. Like it's dead. I think that's pretty much everything that I read. I mean, there wasn't much to say on it in the first place,
no,
but I think
no,
we both wanted just to say just to talk about the graph and why anyone would
dumb.
graph. Yeah, like why graph this? But I think what would have been a good discussion is is to move on from this onto something else, because I think I brought it up with you. Like someone I was talking to on Twitter brought up whether sex, because you like the philosophy of science, don't you?
I
Um,
do. I do like
yeah,
philosophy of science.
that's not necessarily my field, and I thought it'd be nice for me viewers to get a little bit of discussion going on whether not gender, but sex as a spectrum, because this isn't something I've necessarily come across before, um, but it would be worth discussing if you would be interested.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I took like with I took a philosophy of sex course, I think like a year and a half ago, I think, and it very much came at it from a quote unquote continental viewpoint in that the reader or the readings that were assigned all came from, the sort of continental viewpoints. A lot of Fausto Sterling and Butler and um uh Althusser and uh other people along those lines. And it is a really fascinating issue to me. Um, and I think this is actually an area of philosophy that sees a ton of crossover with quote unquote analytic and continental philosophy,
Yeah.
because it really does start to converge. And I wish the two traditions would talk to themselves, or talk to each other a lot more than they currently do. And I mean the history of this whole, I mean, because it really, if you actually look at the history, from what I remember correctly, the history of like the sex gender dichotomy originally, like the original viewpoint of people who, were in gender scholarship was that sex. This is something that a lot of people don't realize is that, when they were dealing with transsexuals and people who wanted to have their sex changed, the original viewpoint was that gender is something that is unchanging. It's something that's static throughout someone's life. And actually sex, biological sex, is the thing that can be changed. That was sort of the original feminist viewpoint, which is which very much contrasts, I think, the current view in sociology and in gender studies and in the philosophy of science, that sex is something that is static and gender is something that is fluid. And very much subject to change throughout someone's life. So you have a lot of people, basically saying that gender is something that is a complete social construct, while sex is something that's biologically defined and can't be changed no matter what you want to do about it. And so you had this flip. I think it was in the 1960s. I don't know. But now you're starting to have this new wave of people that are saying, well, hey, let's actually go back to this idea that sex is something that can be fundamentally changed, um, and let's also maintain that gender can be changed, but let's say that sex is also sort of a social construct. So I remember reading, Fausto Sterling and Butler were the two main proponents of this, and it's interesting to me because I think any sort of question about whether or not sex is a social construct is just going to come down to a question of whether or not this sex gender dichotomy even exists in the first place. I remember reading Althusser's conception of a problematic, which basically says that it asks us the question of whether or not this dichotomy in the first place sort of constrains our possible understanding of sex and gender in the first place. Like, do we actually need to have this dichotomy at all? And what is the relationship between these two things that we call sex and gender? And
Yeah, yeah,
it's
because
a hard question for the feminists to actually justify that. And I think modern day feminists are wanting to sort of break down this binary.
yeah, I mean, like I guess the point of like for me is like this is where I got into any discussion is because when I was talking about sex, I meant it as a purely a descriptive function of
Hmm.
humanity, like as in like of Homo sapiens rather, like purely like not actually related to any normative claims about any individual, but rather just a biological state, like what is a man or a woman, well, male or female.
Hmm.
Now, um, and I said that like the reason that someone brought this up to me and as an issue because they were saying, well, individuals face persecution when they are intersex, and they said that 1 in 100 people could be considered intersex.
Hmm.
And this,
It's actually probably more than that. I think it's actually like 4%.
yeah,
Um,
it seems to be quite high, and I mean the
mhm,
way that they categorize it is somewhat I find open because I think small differences in physical appearance can even lead to intersex. So like aesthetically, like a micro penis or an enlarged clit and stuff like
mhm,
that, are factors to be considered within intersex. Um, but then you've got like different versions. Like how is sex defined? Then becomes the question, and what is the function of sex once it is defined? Like why are we even trying to define this? Which is like what is the purpose behind the scientific analysis in the first place? So it's like are we trying to find out just to accurately purport reality? In which case, we might say that a spectrum might fit and encompass the largest demographic of people. However, are we trying to say for utility? So, like on average, people fit into two binary poles, and then we'll characterize, beyond this universal law, outliers as intersex and go into them of why they don't fit into each camp. And it's quite an interesting subject area because when you look at it like gender, you can see why someone like intimately could question gender roles because well we've been doing that for like the better part of like 100 odd years, at least for women, not so much for men, but at least for women we've been questioning gender roles of like how should women understand themselves, how should women be understood within society, and how they should treat themselves and how should they be treated, and all of this. And it seems that they understand that well perhaps like the psychology of women and their relation between the institutions of society is flawed, and this is like the gender being this understanding of oneself. um but then it seems that when we say sex is a spectrum, it's not necessarily in the same way as gender, where it's an understanding of oneself, but it's an understanding of reality that has been perhaps purported to wrongly in the first place. So that like from what I've heard, like the main argument against it is that the binary spectrum for sex is not accurate, and has caused sociological problems. But then it seems to me that the only reason it's being brought up in the first place is because it relates to the understanding of what feminists and so on go on to do with gender in the first place. That there is a sociological issue relating to individuals of a certain sex, gender, and so on. And in which case, what we need to tackle is the sociological problems and not necessarily, the normative construct itself. So I'm just wondering what you would think of that. Like, do you think that sex is it purely a scientific, or does it come with normative baggage as well?
Well, I'm of the viewpoint that ultimately all science is going to be tainted by normativity in some sort of fashion. I mean, I don't think like if we look at the history of the science of biology and the way especially that the current binary sexual model came to develop, it's a fairly recent model, and for a very long period of history, the actual medical model of sex was a single sex model. A man was just a female with an inverted penis, and that there wasn't actually any sexual difference. There was just a single difference in the way, certain body parts function. But at the very root of it, this um, uh, hormonal chromosomal and brain structure, there wasn't any actual difference on that sort of level, and it's only recently that we've come to appreciate those sort of things. And if we take the sort of Kuhnian approach, Thomas Kuhn, who is probably my favorite philosopher and I'm very, very sympathetic to, I do believe that as time goes on, we actually should be shifting our understanding of science, our understanding of of mankind and the structures that seem to support our understanding of the world. We will shift it depending on the sort of social factors that confront us. And so I think that there's a very strong case to be made that actually at the level of these scientists working in biology, they are being tainted in some sense, by the actual gender binary, because actually going into this, into the study of what makes a man a man and what makes a woman, or whether or not such a distinction exists, they are already tainted by this preconception. I mean, someone can come to you and say, "Oh, I don't believe in any distinction between a man and a female," but I honestly, I don't believe them at all, because there is this sort of self-evidence of there being a natural binary between men and female, men and women. And I do agree that it's probably, something that's culturally conditioned upon us. But even the most radical feminists, I mean, you will see people, for example, the fact that there are a lot of people who will say that, sex is a not a binary, and it's a very
Spectrum.
large, spectrum and continuum. It seems to be very confusing to me, because that still means that there are sort of two ends of this continuum. There still exists male and female. So what you're doing is you're not saying that, male and female are sort of meaningless words, which is what a lot of people like to say. They want to say, oh, there's no such thing as sex at all. They're just trying to expand the scope of what it means to have a certain sex, but still we are confined in some way by a binary, and it just means that this binary is just two extremes of a spectrum. But I don't think that actually gets at the core issue of what a lot of people have, which is that we're still confronted with this male female binary in the first place, and any investigation into that can't be done in isolation of that very binary in the first place. So
Yeah,
I don't know how to approach that, but
I even said this to somewhat, not that well explained actually, but I said that I think you're just reiterating my point in the sense that we're both describing the same thing. I said it as I said two sexes with intersex as outliers, and they said no, spectrum better encompasses this. And I said I don't see how. Like, you just said that most people typically are either on one end or the other, and then there's outliers in the middle of the spectrum. And in my model, it's exactly the same thing. In which case, we're making the same points, um, but what then I said, like, why do you want to create a new model? And I think this is what people don't consider. It's like, why do we, what is this is like why philosophy is about. What is the good of science in the first place? Why do we do it? And ultimately, like, scientific analysis is like, we don't just start researching stuff arbitrarily a lot of the time. We'll have an understanding in mind of what we want to achieve, or what we do. And, like, I'm not saying that all reasoning is inductive, but rather that there will always be some inductivity within any field. And my point is that it seems that a bit arbitrary to say, like, no, what we want to do is to redefine sex as a spectrum, and then they always say a because, and it's the because that we need to tackle. It's not the actual understanding, because the understanding isn't being modified. We're not actually adding any new information for people to adhere to and understand the world greater. What we're doing is we're saying that no, there's a sociological issue coming from this, in which case we need to tackle that sociological issue. And it's like, what is it? It's like, well, institutionally, sex for intersex people has led to surgeries that have defied bodily autonomy. Well, in which case, then, that's the issue that we need to tackle: bodily autonomy, and how we approach that in a social sphere, rather than just start attacking, science as a philosophy. Because, like, I think Shadow, if he's watching this, he'll love it, because he loves to think of science as a philosophy. I don't know if he'd love this conversation, but he always says that, science is just a philosophy. And in the sense that science is just another institution. It operates on a good, and how we invest in science and how we go into science is very important. But how we necessarily categorize information, although it is important, so long as it's being made to be unbiased, is the point in the first place. That, like, for example, there should be no negative or positive connotations with being male, female, or intersex in either model, is what needs tackled in this case. And that was the point I was trying to make to this person, so that we could understand that, for example, it's like with Foucault. It's like when he says, like, gender is, like, culture is a construction that creates individuals more different to nature. Like, it's not that it's more malleable than nature is, yeah, but it's not something that you can just change. You can't, like, for example, you just want people to just change your way of thinking in the world. Like, oh no, now I know gender is a spectrum. I now have a total new conceptualization of gender. Well, no, because you're using the same information to come to the exact same conclusions. You are thinking pretty much the same way. And the thing is that I can see the sociological issues that relate to their wanting to change the model occurring in a new model anyway. So that means that, when you're saying, like, for example, there's normative behind the scientific, that's where we need to look in all cases. Like, why are we doing this? What is the benefit of this? And change what social institutions which create the scientists in the first place. Because there's no point in changing science before you change who scientists are, what scientists are, and why they want to bring around these things. Like, you're not going to convince if you had a Nazi scientist, they're going to be researching different things and coming to different conclusions than someone who's a liberal scientist or a libertarian and so on. Like, the people themselves will reason slightly differently because they will be motivated and driven into certain fields and so on. Like, what institutions develop differently depending on who we are as a people. And I think people need to consider that before we just say, no, no, what we need to do is redefine this particular institution. It's like, no, we need to redefine who we are as a people.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of hits on this idea that still is probably the most popular view in the philosophy of science, and of course in science itself. It's this delineation or this distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification, and it basically says that it doesn't matter the way in which we come to know something in science. It doesn't matter the way in which we come to know that these hormones tend to be more frequent in what appears to be this category of sex. What really matters is the justification we have for saying that something like this is true or not. So, and Kuhn's, probably one of his most famous doctrines, is essentially that, well, there's actually zero way you can separate the context of discovery from the context of justification, because we are so rooted, we are so intimately connected with the society that we live in, that there's no way to examine or judge or understand all of these scientific discoveries in isolation of the very paradigms, using the Kuhnian term, that we're working in. And I think the step that is needed in philosophy of science and in maybe gender studies and in sociology is to, I think, find a new model to talk about sex and gender that doesn't involve this sort of binary. Because, I mean, when this individual described brought up these exceptional cases of transsexuals, this 1.7%. I mean, ultimately the response to this by scientists will say, well, okay, sure, but that still means that this binary exists. It just, you get into these really narrow discussions about, okay, well, let's just broaden it just a little bit. But, you know, I think that's actually missing the point about why there are these cases in the first place. I mean, using, again, Kuhnian terminology, we could view these individuals, these transsexuals, as being sort of anomalies on which we can come to understand a better model. I of course think about Freud's approach to developing psychological development. I mean, it was through these very atypical, anormal psychological patients that he crafted this this psychical model of the mind. It was from these very fringe cases that he did this, and I I'm not a huge, supporter of psychoanalytic import into different areas of philosophy, but I of course see the value of it. But I think the fact that there are these exceptional cases are evidence that there are anomalies that our current understanding of science just simply can't explain. And this should be evidence to us that we need to actually completely change our model or paradigm of sex in order to match it. And I
Yeah.
don't see any reason for not doing that ultimately.
See, I guess my point in this case would be that I agree that the paradigm is flawed and that it needs changed. It's just what I don't think is that we can radically change anything. And I would take a Hegelian stance on this, and I would say that, or even like with Foucault, for example, he argues that the individual was it the I think he says that the ancient Christian couldn't have couldn't have done anything about slavery. They couldn't have said slavery was wrong because of the culture they lived in. It was inconceivable to them
Mm-hmm.
of what this inequality existed and was wrong, and they just wouldn't have seen it. They couldn't have seen it because of who they are, the culture they lived in, and the institutions they abided by. I agree. I don't think they can. I think even in you can see, you get people who, let's say, may think they can see it. They can never know it because knowledge is and this is the whole ask yourself thing come back. Is like knowledge is only fundamentally true if it's normatively true. We only agree that something is accurate if we all agree that it's purported accurately in the first place. So then it comes to the connection, the cultural connection between individuals. This intersubjectivity is how we define what is correct and what is incorrect. Like we will say, like, as a culture, like it is right or wrong in regards to anything based on like our perceptions. Now, if some person perceives something that another person doesn't, they have no reason to believe that he's not hallucinating or if he's not mad or anything like that. They start dismissing him, and this is the point. Like the madness itself is this outlier of perception, this differing of perception beyond a normative system, which then gets categorized and rejected. And probably veganism was a good example of that. And this is why I don't like ask yourself's position with veganism, because it leaves veganism being open and just getting rejected as madness. But the point I'm trying to make is that, like, when we're looking to create a new model which to understand sex, then the only thing that we're going to be able to go back on and fundamentally understand is to sort of fundamentally grasp this model is the current model we have. We're going to rely on our current institutions to forward any reinstitution. And my worry is that if we reject these institutions, if we just reject them, then what we've rejected is our understanding in the first place. We've rejected any understanding we could have, and we'll end up in what's called sometimes a conceptual loss, in which we end up in like where the French Revolution was. They understood that they wanted to bring democracy, but they didn't know how, because they didn't know what a democratic institution looked like. So then, by rejecting all of the power structures of that society and the institutions of power, they left themselves institutionless, in which they just ended up devolving into terror, where they just kill any authority that popped up, because they knew that it wasn't democratic, but they didn't know the positive of that was just purely negative. It was just this. It is not it's not democracy. And so what I think we'll have to do within science and is understand when we look towards reality that we need, by adhering to these values best of science, right? And we'll have
Yeah,
to accurately purport reality. Sorry, continue.
yeah, like I agree. Like I can totally see the Hegelian bent, and I actually I think this is where we get a lot of overlap because in science I would probably consider myself an instrumentalist of some form, like similar to John Dewey's view. And Dewey, of course, was greatly inspired by Hegel and was a Hegelian himself for a very long period of time. And I mean, I think unlike Aristotle, who said that philosophy and sort of changes in the way in which we view the world. He said that this was done by man's inclination to wonder. Dewey essentially said that actually no, it comes out of practical need. The reason that we will begin to shift our model is because we'll be faced with a new set of social circumstances that prompt us to begin an investigation. And I do agree that there is no way in which we can like there's no way that we can just go out there right now and just change the model. It's not possible. It'll take a period of time for enough people to sort of get around to this idea. But it's also sort of an issue. I mean, I think where I disagree with you here a bit is that I'm unsure about because, for example, if you were to travel back in time right now, and talk to these slave owners or people who participated in the slave trade, would you say that they were morally wrong for doing what they were doing, or do you think that this idea of rightness and wrongness is very much confined to the sort of social conditions that we live in?
Well, as I say, I'm a moral realist, and I do think there is a right and wrong. I just think it's relative to our
Right,
perceptions. They wouldn't be able to see the wrongness, is what my argument would be,
right,
and I wouldn't be able to convince them of it. Um, the point is that I would, from my arguments for their wrongness, would seem unintelligible.
right. Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. No, I can definitely see. And
and in the
my
future,
question would be,
they'll look back at us and they'll say, "Well, like, disgusting." And I think this just purports that the reason is historical, and I think that's Gadamer. Like it relates to hindsight is a powerful tool. We look back, and it's easier to look back than it is to look forward because we can see ourselves in the past and we can see a method of thinking, but they have no idea how to conceptualize something which is that has not been conceptualized. They can't create out of nothing. And I think that's the fundamental difference between not being able to look back rather than able to, look forward, as it were. Like we can only see as far as we can, as far as our understanding or conceptualization will allow us to. But people in the future have already are being born with those concepts which we have not yet created.
right. And I think that yeah, I think this might be a place where we just disagree. And I think it's mostly just simply because I have not read Hegel, and I've not read a lot of these thinkers that you draw your ideas from, I think. Because I very much, I would believe in sort of a timeless sort of moral theory. I don't think that it's relative in any way, shape, or form. I don't see how
Yeah.
norms could be relative, but well, no, but I do. I can actually understand the fundamental draw of that. But I mean, initial reactions are, of course, that it does justify a lot of heinous things. But again, I'm
I
looking at
would say
that
it
from my
justifies
or
nothing. I would agree there. Like, for example, it only explains it, I would say. Like, an explanation wouldn't be a justification. So, for example, the way that they treated slaves, it's never justified. It's never okay. There's no the negative moral value there that we can perceive now. It's there. We can see that this is heinous, this is wrong. But the point is, I don't think it's like, for example, with tribal morality, they didn't understand a lot of the time what morality was in the first place. They didn't understand what the values they should be adhering to were. because they had no way of perceiving them. And this is I think the argument where we might differ, because you with Kuhn, like sometimes I don't know, how do you feel, actually I should probably ask you this, how do you feel about the idea of, do you believe in moral progression, or do you believe in like maybe like a reoccurrence of the same, in that regard, that morals do not progress and that we're always in a similar paradigm? It was like it's just a one moral set over another moral set. It's just different value sets that exist in different structure, in different like linear periods.
Yeah, so the reason why, yeah, no, I don't think I'd agree in moral progression. And I think the primary reason I would be skeptical of that is just because of my belief in sort of norms being sort of a very fundamental basis of all thought and reason in the first place. And I don't think that the process of reason has really changed over the course of, human history. I don't think the way in which we arrive at thoughts itself differed, in the 16th century as to now. And I think that norms themselves were really at the fundamental root of coming up with different arguments and whatnot, and the very basis of logic. I mean, the fact that, classical logic, which is really seen still as probably, well, if you're I guess, you believe in some non-classical theory of logic, but let's set those aside. I mean, Aristotle came up with, or at least documented, and wrote down our classical laws of logic, and those have stayed constant, since he wrote them down, at least from the way that we can understand the world. And I think that in itself requires a sort of moral foundation. And if morals progress in some way or another, I'm unsure how it could account for a lot of these very theoretical things in philosophy that do not seem subject to progression. I think that's where I would have an issue with.
Like, for example, if logic is stagnant, then how could morals be stagnant? Because it's the method in which we would evaluate, in the first place. Like, it's how we would come to the values in the first place is the same. So the values are not progressing, and perhaps it would be like rather that they differ at times depending on the stimuli we are presented with. I think for me, though, I would argue that in this situation, that rather that, methodology has remained the same, but that is always been in relation to something. So, for example, like, when we talk about like science, I would say that regardless of how science looks now, it mightn't be completely accurate, but I would say that it is 100% better than science 1,000 years ago. It more accurately purports to the world. Now, does that mean it's foolproof? Of course not. Does it mean that essentially we could be making some fundamental errors? Yes, we certainly could. But I would say that it's a more developed system, and that the more complex and developed systems usually contain within them, a greater understanding of existence. It allows for example, the laws of logic are incredibly vague. What the identity of an object, for example, seems is to call into it before you can even call it P. In the first place, you have to identify it and understand it. Now, it's this identification of objects and an objective reality in which I would say is what we're doing. Our understanding might be the same of it, but how much of we are viewing of it is not. We see more and more, and we see more specifically, and we see more generally sometimes. And it's where we focus this gaze that I think matters to me. How we understand and how we conceptualize based on this faculty of logic, in which I think, unfortunately, are forced to accept. I don't think there's necessarily a methodological system like logic that functions the same way. But then, once we accept it, I don't think that necessarily forces us to come to the same conclusions. We come to a variety of conclusions based on the evidence we can perceive within the world. And if our perceptions are greater and deeper, then we come to see that, the world and the people who are in it are an endless task. I think Murdoch says this, she comes to see her stepdaughter as an endless task. And yeah, like I'll never fully understand myself and other people, and morals will continually, become deeper and better and vary in different ways. And perhaps I'm making some fundamental errors that I will not be aware of. It doesn't necessarily justify those errors. It makes it understandable, like why I've made them. And I think that's my point with it. Like morals, I would argue, do progress, but perhaps we'll have to agree to disagree.
Right. I mean, I think at the sort of I would disagree actually with you on probably most of that, simply because my view of scientific progress is not one that is rational. I don't really believe in the rationality of science. In insofar as we can say at this very moment that our scientific theories are are better than, another another paradigm system. And
Yeah,
I guess I sort of I it's weird. I think I hold a well, no, I guess I'm trying to think of how best to frame this. But like, for example, I believe very much, like, if I'm trying to explain why I hold this, it's that at the very root, I think, of philosophy is this sort of intertwining of, epistemology, and ethics and logic. I think that those three things are intimately connected with each other, and it's from that we spawn certain ontological claims about the world. But the truth of these ontological claims are going to be dependent upon certain features of language. um, so that's why I'm like, I would call myself an incommensurabist, incommensurabist. That's a weird
yeah,
word, about scientific entities. Like, I don't think there's any way to compare our current scientific theories to the scientific theories that existed 300 years ago. And I think any sort of comparison or neutral ground
yeah,
under
because
which we can do
always,
that is impossible.
yeah, it's always judged by our standard in this case. So
Right.
like, would of course we'll make the argument like our way of thinking is the best way of thinking in this way, because if it is a variety of thought or understanding, then it would be almost unintelligible. It seems to contradict the way in which we're what we are almost. It's to call into question those values that create us in the first place.
Hmm.
It's you know what is the purpose of science? Why we do science? The whole institution comes into conflict with that previous institution. Would you say that would be like an accurate like understanding?
Yeah, yeah, I think that is a fairly accurate understanding. And at the very, again, I think at the very root of this is I put a lot of primacy on language itself. I guess sort of Wittgensteinian, actually, I would argue Fregean, sort of approach that the way in which we understand the world is going to be through language, and not some sort of perceptual link that we have to the world. I don't believe in this sort of correspondence model of truth. I think it's dependent upon, all of these language games that we play. But there are certain things like ethics and logic and epistemology that are done independently of this sort of investigation into the actual world. And those sorts of things are going to be timeless in nature. A theory of meaning is ultimately timeless. It can't shift depending on the sort of social conditions that we live in. And at the same time, the same goes for our ethical norms, because I believe in this universality of norms, that all norms are ultimately of the same kind. And if epistemic norms are going to be timeless and aren't subject to social change, then so too must ethical norms as well. But I mean, I can definitely see, like, this is not me saying, "Oh, I'm right, you're wrong," because I can totally see the sort of view that you're coming from. Um, and I think that it's a very good question to look into about. Ultimately, I am of the opinion that all philosophy is going to come down to this question of norms, because I think it underpins ultimately all of these philosophical positions, but almost no one actually investigates this. Um, But I'd
Yeah,
be
I think you're
so
right.
interested in seeing like a Hegelian approach um,
Yeah,
to
I mean,
norms.
in some respects, I think I wouldn't call it as much of a contrast, but in some respects, I think my view in a scientific manner would probably be closer to when we talk about it, is almost closer to Popper than it is to Kuhn, in the
Hmm.
sense if I'm arguing for progress, I'm relating to saying that there is a connection between those two scientific fields in which Kuhn says no, we're talking
Right.
two separate spheres in the first place, onward, because he would say that there's one and then there's the other, because if they're incommensurable in that point, I think. If I'm understanding. So in a scientific way, uh, I would be arguing for the same point that, like, Popper's arguing that there is scientific progress and that it purports to reality. When you're saying, well, no, because how we obviously understand reality in the first place, the faculties in which we use, um, they're not actually, they're already prejudicial. That we're incapable of escaping ourselves to find truth. Like,
Yeah.
what is objective is inherently foreign to us. I think is something that, like, comes from this.
Hmm.
Um, and linguistically, if we look at it like that, I would say that, like, it does seem foreign, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's impossible. I think, like, for example, it's that moment. Like, for example, if we say that what is objective from us, then we'll realize that when we look at the objective, we ourselves are destroyed. And the void is a self destruction, but it's not empty. It's noisy. It's full of reality. I think Blanchot, talks about this with when we look at reality and we say, this woman, what we've done is destroyed the indistinguishable experience, the infinite experience of reality, and we've characterized it to make it intelligible. And once we've done that, we've conceptualized it, and once we've conceptualized it, we've changed what reality is for us. We've
Mm.
changed it. We've turned her into this woman.
Hmm.
Um, and I agree. But it says that there's, like, for example, he says, I think, is death this moment of pure possibility? He's talking about, like, Heidegger. It's like, is death the moment of pure possibility? The infinite possibility, or is death, um, the moment of impossibility, of the impossibility of possibility? That moment in which you're neither dead nor alive. So, like, it would be like a link, it would be like a conceptual loss in this sense. I do not know. I cannot make intelligible the world around me because I am destroyed in when I look at this world. Like, if I see a world that was purely, taste, textures, and physical objects, I think McIntyre argues that no questions can be asked or answered of this. It's empty of us, and from us comes this justification in the first place. So I can definitely see why you would argue this point, if that is an accurate representation of your point. Um, I guess we'll have to agree to disagree on this, and we can talk about it another time, hopefully, in some more detail, and we can go into, the epistemology of it, and see if we can. I doubt we'll be able to hash it out, but we'll see if we can come to any
Well, yeah, I mean,
mutual understanding.
I think it's me. I haven't read a lot of the thinkers that you were drawing from,
Oh
and
no,
I
same,
suspect,
same, same here.
yeah.
Like,
And I'd be super interested in doing that, and seeing, because I can, at least I can feel the overlap between our views, but there are just a few points that sort of make it impossible to reconcile our viewpoints. And I can definitely think of some like brief excerpts I could send to you and get your thoughts on them.
yeah, and
And
I'll
hopefully
try
you
and do the
likewise.
same.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that would be great, man. And hopefully this won't be the last conversation we'll have. And
Oh,
I
hopefully
don't know,
not. Yeah.
if there's anything else you'd like to bring up before we end it, or do you think if we've talked about this topic enough? Or it's up to you.
Um,
Do you have any
I think,
closing remarks or anything? Sorry.
I mean, going back to the, no, I mean, I think that that is really it. I do agree with sort of a Kuhnian, picture of science, and that will thus influence my outlook on on a concept of sex and its distinction from gender and whatnot. But I think what we do agree on is that in order to even talk about a new model, there's going to have to be a very fundamental change at the level of how scientists conduct science itself. It's not enough to just publish a paper and say, "Hey guys, look, this model of science doesn't work," because ultimately we're going to be growing up in a society that is going to constantly reinforce this binary to us, and there really doesn't seem to be a way to approach sex in a different type of model when we are so influenced by this model on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think it's just the only thing that we're really disagreeing on is like how we would do that. So I
Yes,
think
yeah,
yours is more radical and mine is more conservative in the regard that um, mine approaches it by your value, by you use the what I would understand to be this the values in which you already have and adhere to them as best as possible. And I would say that the divide that allows science to progress is almost the divide which allows morals to progress, which is in Hegelian philosophy, which is the conscience. And but in science, I think it would be a similar, it would be like a scientific conscience in which you would pull from, rather than adhering to those understandings you currently have, you adhere to those values in which you seek in the first place, and that ultimately would allow you to create and conceptualize a new mental ability. It would give you a new mental ability in which to then create a new model. And I think in yours it would be more radical, wouldn't it? It would be something that we would have to pull ourselves away from this understanding, rather than we have to reject those values in which we have and replace them fundamentally before we can even think about creating a new institution, because
right.
we'll always end up creating the same thing if we try and use the same faculties. And
Yeah.
I think in a weird way, we're kind of having the Chomsky Foucault debate on
Yeah,
justice.
I did actually think about mentioning that, but no, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah, but it's been fun, man, and hopefully, we can do this again. And
oh,
I found it
definitely,
really
definitely.
interesting. Found it really
Yeah.
interesting. And if you want to do something for your channel, and for everyone who's watching, actually, you will be linked in the description. I forgot to mention, and I forgot to mention at the start, Rem has his own YouTube channel. So for those viewers that are watching, go check him out. It's Rem the Bath Boy. He's, as we said, he's a third-year analytics student, and he does a lot in the philosophy of science. And if you found his comments interesting and well developed, I suggest that you go and check out his channel.
Thank you
So
very much.
yeah, so it's been nice chatting to you, mate, and
Yeah, you too.
I'll catch you later.
All right. Sounds good. Have a good night.
You have a good
Or
night, mate.
whatever time it is there.
Yeah, it's like 12 nearly. Oh, there we go. He's gone. Well, thank you everyone for watching, and hopefully I'll do some more of these discussions again. If you found found it interesting, let me know, and I'll have a look at some of the comments. I didn't really get a chance to see if. Unfortunately, I don't have super chat, so I can't just go through. Apparently, Rem shouldn't go easy on us. There's no bearing on the merit of the argument. I guess the graph doesn't have a merit on the bearing of the argument, which is something that is worth discussion at another time. Oh, thank you. My face is nice. I'm glad. I'm glad that if whatever goes wrong, you can always rely on aesthetics. Said that he can be wrong. I think he agrees with the conceptually, but nothing about his personality actually shows you. Yeah, I think I agree, Shadow, that he said that he can be wrong, but then he doesn't. Ask yourself says that he can be wrong, but he doesn't actually show any any coherence to this point. He doesn't actually admit that he can be wrong. Like, so, for example, there's times when I make mistakes all the time, and I'm like, oh, I messed up. And if anyone points out any mistakes I made in this, go right ahead. I'll definitely acknowledge them. I make them all the time. Um, you know, one of the longest straw man runs. Okay, apparently. Da, da, da. He says he won the debate by making, he says he's won the debate by making a descriptive statement about mass consensus. So it's completely vacuous, in fairness. Yeah, I like that comment. Well done, Deacon Kurik, thanks. Yeah, so like Shadow, actually, that's another good point. Like, he never actually says that insanity is a bad thing. He did a very similar thing to me once, where he said, it was like, he called this something when we were debating, and then I said, surely that's ad hominem, and he was like, no, it's just an insult because it doesn't relate to your argument. So it's one of those things where you just called it something, and he's like, oh, it's not ad hominem because I don't think your argument has anything to do with you being a dickhead. You know, do you know what I mean? Like, it's like it's somewhat right in that sense. Like, but it's like, well, you know, if you're going to make a descriptive statement like out of the blue like that, then I think, you know, like the sky is blue. You know, you know, I don't know, like. The sun is yellow. I like cake. They're irrelevant to a conversation, but he's clearly using them in a prescriptive manner. And I think to say that he's not is, to be entirely honest with you, disingenuous. I'll scroll down a little bit further because there's clearly been a debate going on there, and I'm fortunately going to read it right now, but I might read it back, guys. Right. Well, I think that will probably do it for now. But you know, if anyone would like to, you know, see anything in the future, leave a comment on this video and let me know what kind of discussions and debates you'd like to see within the future, and hopefully I can bring them around for you. If you liked it, tell us what you liked, tell us what you didn't like, so that I can try and, you know, accommodate to you, the audience, because that's what it's about. It's about trying to bring good content and valuable content for everyone. You know, and I hope you enjoyed my discussion with Rem, who is, you know, time and time again, the conversation I've had with him, shown himself to be a capable and well-read philosopher. So I hope you all have a good day and try to gain some perspective.